for today, we've got the remainder of the HTML lectures. So that was essentially, the HTML was designed to be split over the second hour last week and the first hour this week. So I'll get through, I'll finish that. We may run slightly 5 minutes or so into the second lecture, but hopefully I can avoid that. Once we've done that, I'll go through a bit of an introduction to user interface design and some design principles, and that will lead into what you'll be doing in the lab tomorrow or Wednesday, depending on when you have your lab scheduled. So this was the last slide I think I got up to, was just the demonstration of a very basic HTML page and how HTML works. So we'll start, I suppose, just with a bit of a brief recap of the history of HTML, so what it is and how it came about. So I suppose HTML first, it has its roots in, I suppose, Enquire, which was a system proposed in 1980 by Tim Berners-Lee to help certain researchers share, basically share documents, share resources, share data sets, and so on. Excuse me a second. So as part of the system that they developed, it had a number of different components, but HTML was designed as a markup language to be able to describe and represent the documents that were to be shared, or specific documents that are to be stored on the system. And in terms of the modern web, HTML is a markup language used to structure and represent individual pages or content on the World Wide Web, so HTML pages. In addition to, so if you think about the web though, it's more than just HTML. So okay, your browser, it's designed to be able to render or display HTML pages, but there also needs to be a system for actually requesting and getting information off servers, so a way to communicate to a server and request specific pages. So for this, we have HTTP. So HTTP is, I'm sure you've all seen the four letters HTTP before. So for instance, if you look at a URL in a web browser, you might have seen http://google.com.au or google.com. So HTTP is a protocol. So a protocol you can think of as a method or as a method for communicating between two entities, in this case, between your browser and a server. So, I mean, we're all familiar at some level with the concept of protocols. They occur in all different forms of communication. But yeah, protocol is one that is used for web servers. So if you, when your browser wants to contact the web server, it makes a request using the HTTP protocol. The HTTP protocol specifies a number of methods, so get and post are used for requesting data, and your browser will make a request with the HTTP protocol for a specific resource or specific HTML page, which is then sent to the browser, and your browser can then render that HTML page. So this is just, it's a little small, but it's just a brief history of web browsers and a number of different web technologies. So you can see there, it's just highlighted at the end, html5 is what we'll be sort of covering in this lecture and this lecture series. But you can see there's a number of different, so HTML traces its roots back quite a way. You can see it's developed over multiple iterations. Browsers have evolved, so we've got, back here, we've got things like Netscape, which forked into Mozilla Firefox and now it's no longer around. We have a number of different browsers, so Chrome and Firefox are the two that are most common ones that you'll encounter in this course. Internet Explorer is also a very common one I've seen a lot of people using, but in general would be discouraged for this course. Not so much for the HTML sections, but once we get onto the CSS parts of the course, you'll find that some features aren't, yeah? So once we get to CSS, some CSS features aren't actually supported by Internet Explorer. So some of the exercises that we'll do you'll be able to, like, they'll work in Chrome or Firefox, but then you'll just copy them over to Internet Explorer and it just won't work. So it can be a little hard then to work out, to see whether or not it's your code or the browser. So the web is formed of a number of different components. So we have servers. So these are, I suppose, computers that understand the HTTP protocol, and they essentially are listening for requests from other entities made using the HTTP protocol, and then they can serve those requests. We have a number of different protocols. HTTP is a very common one, but we have others. FTP is used for just transferring files. HTTPS, so that's HTTP but encrypted. We have also then browsers. So browsers are the actual programs such as Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Internet Explorer that we can then use to render and actually view our web content, so our HTML pages that we get from the servers. So I won't spend a lot of time on this, but just an interesting concept to be aware of, and this ties a little bit back into security that we went through in week 1, is the notion of a sandbox. So a sandbox, in browser terms, it's essentially the idea of creating an isolated environment in which to run your code, or or in which to view web pages or run code obtained from the internet. That then it isolates that environment in which you're running that code from the rest of the computer. So let's say you obtain and attempt to run some malicious code. If it's sandboxed, you have the idea that that code can only access resources that are, or resources or memory that are in your isolated environment. So it can't then access a number of system resources and say files and areas that you don't want it to. So the idea here is that you limit access to the parts of your system by creating an isolated environment in which to run your code. So the sandboxes come up in a lot of different areas in information technology, but a lot of browsers implement sandboxing. So if you, for instance, Chrome, every single tab is its own sandbox, so the resources allocated for each tab are essentially isolated. Firefox, it does not do it on a tab-by-tab basis. Firefox creates just one big sandbox for the whole browser. And I think Internet Explorer, similar to Chrome, creates one for each individual tab. So you can see here I've got just a link to a number of different sandboxing features for each of Chrome, Internet Explorer, and Firefox. That's just there. You can have a look at this in your own time. It's not so important. It's just interesting to be able to see a number of different features. So HTML5, which is what we'll be covering in this course, is the most recent iteration of the HTML standard. So HTML, that slide that I put up earlier, you would have seen that showed the development or history of internet technologies. You can see that HTML, its original roots were quite a way back, a number of decades, and the standard has undergone a number of refinements and number of iterations. Well, we're up to HTML5, which is the one that we cover in this course. So something that is key to note also, HTML is not a programming language, it's a markup language. So in the second lecture last week, when I was talking about hypermedia and SGML, and a little bit on HTML, one of the things that I was really trying to get at was that what we do is we have a set of content, and then we want to be able to use HTML to provide structure to that content. We want to be able to show, we have, say, a set of text. We want to be able to highlight what sections of text mean what and how they fit together. So HTML5 allows us to, HTML allows us to essentially mark different sections of our content or different pieces of content with some kind of meaning, and to try and provide a structure that demonstrates how they link together. And I'll show some more concrete examples of this throughout the lecture. But yeah, HTML, so it's a markup language. So you have then, this HTML code is then able to be read and displayed by a browser. So your browser, once you have your structured code or your structured content, your browser is able to, according to a set of default rules for how it displays various types of content, render and display this to the user. Again, I want to note that HTML is purely about structure. It's about structuring your content. The mechanisms by which we then specify how this structured content should be rendered or displayed are different. We do that with CSS, which we'll cover next week. But actually, I can show a really good demonstration of that. So if I just bring up a browser, so I'll get Chrome. So this is a site, you'll see it again next week. So CSS Zen Garden. So what we have here is just a HTML page. It's quite attractive and looks quite nice. Then we'll select this. So the HTML for this page and this page, the HTML files are identical. All we're doing here is we're shifting the set of rules that the browser uses to display or to work out how to display the structured content. So as I click through each of these, again, it's the same content every time, or the same content, same structure. The difference is purely in the CSS or in the rules that are being defined for how the page should fit together. So this is also a demonstration of why we want to separate the content and its structure. So separate the mechanism by which we define the content and its structure from the mechanism by which we define how that should be displayed. So these CSS pages here, or CSS files that are being used here, they're free, they're open source, so you can have a look at them if you like. But they're designed by professional web developers and graphic artists. So obviously nothing like what we'll get to in this course or what I could do. But I think it's a good demonstration of the power of CSS to be able to, or what you can do once you have structured content just by defining different rules about how that should be displayed. But yeah, same HTML on every page. The only difference there is the CSS rules that we're using to say how the page should be displayed. So HTML file. So a HTML file, you can have two file extensions. If you create a HTML file, you can designate it as a HTML file by giving it either the extension .html or .htm. For all intents and purposes, the two are essentially identical. There's historical reasons for that lead to having two file names, but most web servers will see, if it sees a .htm, it will just interpret that as a .html. So for all intents and purposes, they're essentially interchangeable. That said, I think the web server that we've got, the ICT web server that we use for the group project, if you have a .index.html file, it will render, if you place a file named index.html on that web server and you go to that directory, it will display that, instead of giving you a directory listing, it will just display that page. I don't think it does that for an index.htm file, but anyway, you can cover that in shoots when you're doing the group project. So a HTML file can contain many different types of content. So we have the actual text or the content that you want the users to be able to see. HTML file will then also have some markups, so HTML tags that specify how that text and content is structured, so that tags that try and ascribe some meaning to the content that we have in our HTML page. We can have references to other documents and files, so we can have references to images, references to videos, references to other HTML pages, so other resources either on the web or on other files on your computer. And also links, so hyperlinks to other resources on the web.